The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the towering trees casting elongated shadows across the dense jungle floor. A light mist coiled through the underbrush, slithering between twisted roots and the remains of fallen leaves, creating an eerie stillness that was interrupted only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out a short, sharp cry that echoed and then faded into silence. The jungle was always alive, breathing with an ancient rhythm, but tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, something unseen lurking beneath the surface, waiting. Deep within the labyrinth of greenery, a pair of glowing eyes flickered between the foliage, barely visible against the dappled moonlight that struggled to pierce the thick canopy above. A leopard, its sleek golden coat dappled with black rosettes, moved with effortless grace, its muscles rippling beneath its fur as it prowled forward. It was a creature of the night, a silent hunter, its senses honed to detect the slightest movement. It paused, ears flicking, nostrils flaring as it caught a scent something unfamiliar, something wrong. The jungle was never truly quiet, but now, even the usual sounds, the chirping of insects, the rustling of small creatures had vanished. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. From the safety of a rocky outcrop above, a man watched the leopard through the lens of his binoculars, his breath slow and measured. He was a wildlife researcher, part of a small team that had been tracking the big cats in this remote region for weeks, documenting their movements, studying their behaviors. But this was different. Something about the way the leopard moved, the way its muscles tensed, as if sensing an invisible threat, sent a shiver down his spine. He had spent years in the wild, had seen nature's cruelty up close, but even he could feel it, that primal instinct, that unshakable feeling that something was not right. Then, the first one appeared. It was barely visible at first, just a sinuous shape winding its way through the underbrush, its scales glistening with an unnatural sheen in the moonlight. Then another, and another. The jungle floor seemed to shift, as if the earth itself were moving, rippling like a living thing. A swarm of snakes, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, slithering in unison, their forked tongues flicking as they moved with an eerie, synchronized purpose. The leopard stiffened, its ears flattening against its skull. It had faced many dangers in its lifetime, but this was something beyond instinct, beyond understanding. A tide of venomous fangs, an impossible force, creeping toward it from every direction. The researcher's fingers tightened around the binoculars, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He had seen snake migrations before, but nothing like this. This wasn't natural. Snakes didn't move like this, not together, not with such terrifying coordination. It was as if they were being drawn to something, controlled by some unseen force. His radio crackled, a whisper of static breaking through the oppressive silence, and a voice, hushed and urgent, came through. "Are you seeing this?" It was one of his team members stationed half a mile away, at the edge of the riverbank. The researcher pressed the button on his radio, his voice low. "I'm seeing it. Something's wrong. Snakes don't move like that." "I know." A pause. "Then should we intervene?" That was the question, wasn't it? This was nature's law, the eternal struggle for survival. But this didn't feel like nature. This felt like something else entirely. The leopard, trapped atop a massive root system, let out a low growl, its tail lashing. It could not escape. The snakes were closing in, their movements precise, methodical. The researcher's gut twisted. He had dedicated his life to observing, to understanding, but every instinct in his body screamed that he couldn't just stand by and watch. Then, a sound. It was distant at first, just a faint, rhythmic thudding that grew louder, closer, until the jungle itself seemed to vibrate with it. The snakes, for the first time, hesitated. The leopard's ears twitched. Something else was coming. Something that sent fear, slithering through even the swarm of venomous creatures. And then darkness. A sudden gust of wind ripped through the trees, carrying with it an unnatural chill. And then, as if the night itself had swallowed them whole, the snakes disappeared. The jungle was still once more, the only sign of their presence, the disturbed earth where they had writhed just moments ago. The leopard remained motionless, its breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The researcher lowered his binoculars, his hands clammy. And then the radio crackled again. "You're not going to believe this," the voice on the other end whispered. The researcher swallowed hard. "Try me. There's something in the trees." The jungle had always been a place of secrets, but tonight, those secrets were beginning to unravel. And whatever was hiding in the darkness, it was watching. The radio remained silent after that last cryptic message, but the researcher's grip on it tightened, his pulse quick and heavy. He scanned the dark canopy, his eyes darting from one thick branch to another, searching for any sign of movement. But the jungle had returned to its eerie, expectant stillness, as if whatever presence had disturbed it moments ago had melted into the shadows, watching from somewhere unseen. He exhaled slowly, his breath barely audible over the distant hum of nocturnal insects. The moment was slipping, but its weight lingered. Something had been there. Something had driven away an entire swarm of venomous snakes in an instant, and that something was still out there. He was no stranger to the mysteries of the wild. Dr. Nathan Carter had spent the better part of the last decade tracking predators through some of the most inhospitable terrains on Earth, from the frozen tundras of Siberia to the dense, sweltering rainforests of the Amazon. He had seen animals behave in ways no scientific journal could fully explain. Packs of wolves communicating over impossible distances, elephants mourning their dead with an intelligence that went beyond mere instinct. But this was different. This was something that defied all logic. Nathan had arrived in this remote jungle outpost only 3 weeks ago, leading a small but experienced research team tasked with studying the behavioral patterns of the region's elusive leopard population. The project was backed by a conservation foundation, one that had grown increasingly concerned about the sudden and unexplained decline in big cat numbers over the past year. Leopards that had once roamed freely across the vast jungle were disappearing without a trace, their usual hunting grounds abandoned, their radio collars going silent in the dead of night. At first, the team had suspected poaching, but there were no carcasses, no telltale signs of human interference. It was as if the leopards were simply vanishing. Nathan had spent the first few days reviewing camera trap footage, trying to piece together a pattern, but the images only raised more questions. One moment, a leopard would be stalking through the brush, its muscles coiled in anticipation of a kill. The next frame would be empty, just the rustling leaves and the imprint of paw prints in the dirt. No struggle, no sign of a fight. Just gone. It wasn't natural. And that was what had drawn him deeper into the jungle, compelled him to set up his own night watches in the hopes of catching something, anything that might explain the growing sense of unease creeping into his bones. He wasn't alone in feeling it. The rest of his team had sensed it too, though none of them spoke about it openly. There was the geologist, Sarah Whitmore, who had been studying the region's caves and underground networks, trying to map out areas where the leopards might be retreating. She was practical, methodical, not one to entertain superstitions. But even she had mentioned hearing strange sounds at night low, rhythmic vibrations that pulsed through the ground like the beating of a massive heart. Then there was Miguel Alvarez, their field medic and expert tracker, a man who had spent years with indigenous tribes across South America. He had been the first to suggest that something unnatural was at play here. "The jungle has many eyes," he had said one night over the crackling fire, "and not all of them are friendly." Nathan had dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to campfire paranoia. But now, standing there in the thick of the night, staring at the motionless jungle, that had just moments ago been alive with writhing, venomous bodies. He wasn't so sure anymore. He raised the radio to his lips again, forcing his voice to stay calm. "What do you see?" A pause. Then the same voice from earlier, Ben Foster, the team's equipment specialist, stationed at the riverbank, spoke again, but this time it was lower, strained. "I don't know how to describe it." "Try." Another pause. "Then, it's moving, but not like an animal. It's gliding." Nathan's skin prickled. "Gliding?" "Yeah. Like it's floating between the trees." Nathan's muscles tensed. He had seen countless animals maneuver through the jungle canopy: monkeys, leaping from branch to branch, birds of prey slicing through the air with razor-sharp precision. But gliding, that was something else entirely. He turned in the direction of the riverbank, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth as he started forward. "I'm coming to you," he said, his voice steady. "No," Ben's voice came back sharply. "Stay where you are. This thing, it's heading your way." Nathan froze. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a scent that was faint but distinct, an earthy, musky odor tinged with something metallic. Blood. But not fresh blood. It was older, heavier, like the scent of something long dead, something that should have already rotted away, yet still lingered in the air. He had smelled it before once, years ago, when he had stumbled upon an abandoned poacher's camp deep in the Congo, where piles of animal carcasses had been left to decay in the sweltering heat. But here, in this pristine stretch of jungle, where nothing should have been disturbed, the trees ahead of him trembled, not from the wind, from movement. Something was up there, something that had been watching all along. His fingers tightened around the flashlight strapped to his vest, but he hesitated. Some instinct, something deep and primal, told him that whatever was out there, it wasn't something he wanted to see in the full glare of artificial light. His breath came slower now, controlled, as he reached for the camera strapped around his neck instead, its night vision mode humming softly to life. He raised it, peered through the lens, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The shape was barely distinguishable at first, just an outline against the darkness. But then the details sharpened: the elongated body, the impossibly smooth movements as it weaved through the branches without a sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. And it was looking right at him. Nathan's fingers hovered over the camera's shutter button, his breath locked in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure in the trees wasn't bound by gravity the way any living creature should be. It wasn't clinging to branches or shifting its weight from limb to limb. It moved like liquid shadow, its form undulating as if it were slipping through the very fabric of the night itself. And yet, as surreal as its presence was, the eyes, those cold, unwavering eyes, were unmistakably locked onto him. Then, just as he felt his pulse hammering to its peak, the camera flickered. A sharp, high-pitched whine filled his ears as the screen suddenly distorted, warping the image into an unnatural blur of green and black. He yanked his finger back instinctively. But it was too late. The night vision failed entirely, and the camera powered down in his hands. At the same moment, the wind shifted again, carrying a deep, guttural hiss through the trees. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It was something between a sound that dug into his chest and curled around his ribs like icy fingers. Then, silence. Nathan's muscles burned with the need to move, to run, to break free of whatever unseen force had just locked him in place. But before he could act, his radio crackled again. This time, the voice on the other end was lower, almost muffled, as if spoken from far away, yet it was undeniably close. "Turn around." A shudder rolled down his spine, but he fought against the instinct to obey. The voice hadn't belonged to Ben. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anyone from his team. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the now useless camera, every nerve in his body screaming at him to keep his eyes forward. He had seen too many field reports, too many accounts of experienced explorers, rangers, even seasoned military operatives vanishing under inexplicable circumstances. The one thing they all had in common: they followed a voice they shouldn't have. For a long, stretched moment, he stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No sudden attack, no rush of movement from the trees. Just the feeling, the inescapable certainty that whatever had been watching him hadn't left. It was still there, waiting. Then another voice. This time, real. Human. Nathan? He flinched at the sound, his grip tightening instinctively on his equipment. It was Sarah. And she wasn't alone. The rustling of leaves, the unmistakable crunch of boots against damp earth, signaled that more of his team had finally caught up with him. He exhaled, forcing his shoulders to loosen, as he turned to see Sarah and Miguel stepping into the dim glow of his flashlight beam, their expressions tight with concern. "Did you see it?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting past him to the canopy above. Nathan hesitated, his mind still spinning. He wasn't sure how to explain what he had just witnessed, especially not when his only evidence, the footage, had been wiped clean by whatever force had just killed his camera. Instead, he shook his head, choosing his words carefully. There was something in the trees. Miguel's gaze narrowed. Something? I don't know what it was, Nathan admitted, his voice lower now, tinged with frustration. I was recording, and then my camera just died, right when I had it in frame. Miguel's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. He was usually the first to dismiss anything that smelled of superstition, always grounding things in logic and years of tracking experience. But now, there was something else in his eyes, something almost cautious. We need to get back to camp. Nathan frowned. I'm not leaving without answers. We'll find them in the morning, Miguel countered, his tone firm. But we're not staying out here tonight. Sarah didn't argue. She just nodded, her fingers brushing the radio strapped to her shoulder, as if confirming it still worked. Nathan cast one last glance toward the trees before reluctantly falling in line behind them. But as they made their way back through the thick undergrowth, something gnawed at the edges of his mind, a creeping sensation that this wasn't over. And then they reached camp, or at least what was left of it. The sight stopped them all cold. Their tents, sturdy, reinforced structures meant to withstand jungle conditions, had been slashed open, their supplies scattered across the forest floor. The equipment cases that had once been neatly stacked were overturned, their contents missing or completely destroyed. But it was the radio tower, the one essential link they had to the outside world, that sent a fresh wave of unease rolling through Nathan's gut. It had been toppled, its wires shredded, like something had torn through them with precise, unnatural intent. Sarah was the first to move, rushing forward toward her tent, her breath coming in sharp gasps. No, no, no. She dropped to her knees, yanking open what was left of her equipment bag, but from the way her hands stilled, Nathan already knew the answer before she spoke. The satellite phone is gone. Nathan swore under his breath, his hands balling into fists. This wasn't just some animal tearing through camp in search of food. This was targeted, deliberate. Something didn't want them here. Miguel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. We should have left yesterday. Nathan shook his head, his frustration mounting. No, that's exactly what whoever did this wants. They're trying to scare us off. Well, it's working, Sarah muttered, her voice shaky. Nathan didn't respond immediately. His mind was already working, piecing things together, trying to make sense of the chaos around them. The leopards disappearing, the unnatural snake swarm, the shadow in the trees, and now their only lifeline to the outside world cut off. This wasn't coincidence. Then, movement. Not from the jungle. from inside one of the destroyed tents. Nathan's head snapped toward it, and in the flickering light of the dying campfire, he saw it. A figure. Small. Hunched. Watching them from the darkness. Then, a whisper low, urgent, barely more than a breath. "Leave now, before it finds you." And just like that, the figure was gone. Nathan's breath caught in his throat, his gaze locked on the spot where the figure had stood just seconds ago. The words echoed in his mind, twisting through the growing sense of dread that coiled around his ribs. "Leave now, before it finds you." His instincts screamed to chase after the stranger, to demand answers. But even as his muscles tensed, a different fear crept in, the undeniable certainty that if he stepped into that darkness, he might not come back. Whoever or whatever had just warned them had vanished like a ghost, slipping through the ruins of their camp without a trace. Sarah's fingers curled around his arm, her grip tight enough to snap him out of his daze. Her breathing was uneven, her eyes darting between him and Miguel, as if expecting them to explain what had just happened. But there was no explanation, not one that made any sense. Miguel didn't move for a long moment, his usual composure shaken just enough that Nathan caught it. That alone made his skin prickle. Miguel had spent years surviving in hostile environments, facing dangers that would break most men, but even he looked rattled now. Then, as if the jungle itself had decided to remind them who was in control, a sharp, sudden cry split the night. It wasn't human, it was the unmistakable sound of a leopard, its call filled with something deeper than just a territorial warning. It was distress, fear, something primal and raw. Nathan turned so fast that his boots kicked up dirt, his flashlight beam cutting through the trees, scanning for any sign of movement. The cry came again, closer this time, but distorted, as if it were being dragged through layers of unseen interference. Miguel moved first, already heading toward the sound, his rifle secured but ready. Nathan followed without hesitation, Sarah cursing under her breath, before sprinting after them. The undergrowth swallowed their footsteps, the damp earth muffling the urgency in their pace, as they pushed deeper into the jungle. The trees loomed overhead, their tangled branches sealing them into an inescapable labyrinth of shadows and shifting light. Then they found it. At first glance, it looked like a trap, a makeshift enclosure, formed from twisted branches and thick vines, deliberately arranged in a way that didn't feel natural. Inside, the leopard was barely visible, its golden coat almost indistinguishable from the dappled patterns of the leaves. It was injured, its breathing labored, its massive body tense with exhaustion and pain. But what sent a fresh chill through Nathan wasn't the sight of the wounded animal. It was the markings surrounding its symbols carved into the wood, arranged in patterns that were both intricate and unsettling. Sarah took a step closer, her voice hushed but laced with disbelief. "What is this?" Miguel didn't answer. He was staring at the symbols, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Nathan's stomach tighten. Recognition. "You've seen this before," Nathan pressed, his voice low but firm. Miguel hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "Years ago," he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "In Peru, a village deep in the Andes. They called it a warning." "A warning for what?" Miguel's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping his rifle with more force than necessary. "Something they refused to name." Nathan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. This wasn't just a strange phenomenon anymore. This was deliberate. Someone had constructed this, had placed these markings here with purpose. The leopard wasn't just another casualty of the jungle, it was a message. And whoever had left it behind wanted them to find it. Then, Sarah's radio crackled, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. The voice that came through wasn't from anyone on their team. "Dr. Carter." Nathan stiffened, exchanging a look with Miguel and Sarah before bringing the radio to his lips. "Who is this?" Static. Then, The voice returned, distant but clear. "You need to listen carefully. You're not the only one looking for answers." Nathan's pulse spiked. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, something that sent ice down his spine. "I was in your position once. Thought I could find the truth. Thought I could outlast it. But it doesn't work that way." Nathan's fingers tightened around the radio. What doesn't work that way? More static. Then, the final words before the transmission cut off completely. "The deeper you dig, the worse it gets. And when it finally finds you, it doesn't let go." The radio went silent. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The weight of the message settled over them like a heavy fog, thick with implications they weren't ready to face. Nathan's mind was already running through possibilities. Whoever had just contacted them knew more than they did. And if they were telling the truth, then this wasn't just about the disappearing leopards anymore. It was about something far worse. Then, without warning, the jungle shifted again. But this time, it wasn't the wind or the distant cry of another predator. It was closer, much closer. A shadow moved through the trees, silent and deliberate, watching, waiting. And just like that, Nathan realized the most unsettling thing of all. They weren't just searching for the truth. The truth was hunting them. Nathan could feel it now, not just the weight of the jungle pressing in, not just the eerie silence that had replaced the usual nocturnal sounds, but something else, something deeper, a presence. It was the undeniable feeling of being watched, not just from one direction, but from everywhere at once, as if unseen eyes had been on him long before he even realized they were in danger. His pulse hammered in his ears, and for the first time since arriving, he questioned if he had made a mistake coming here at all. Miguel was scanning the tree line, his posture rigid, his fingers twitching slightly against his rifle. Sarah's expression had lost its usual determined edge. Instead, she looked almost sick with unease. The radio transmission had done something to all of them. It had shifted their understanding of the situation from unsettling to dire. They had come here searching for evidence, expecting something explainable, rational. But there was nothing rational about any of this. The missing leopards, the unnatural swarm of venomous snakes, the shadow that had moved through the trees like it belonged to something not quite human, the carved symbols surrounding the wounded leopard, it was all pointing to something far more dangerous than anything they had prepared for. Then, a sound. A sharp, deliberate snap of a branch from somewhere behind them. Nathan barely had time to turn before Miguel was already moving, his rifle aimed in the direction of the noise, his breathing steady but sharp. The three of them stood frozen in the dim glow of their flashlights, waiting for anything to happen. But the jungle didn't move. No animal scattered, no predator lunged from the darkness. It was just silence, stretched so tight it felt suffocating. And then, Sarah's voice low, shaken, barely more than a whisper. "Where's Ben?" Nathan's stomach dropped. Ben had been with them earlier. He had been right there, following a few paces behind. The same way he always did, quiet, observant, but never straying too far. But now, as Nathan's eyes darted around the clearing, there was no sign of him. The realization hit like a physical blow. He hadn't heard him leave, hadn't heard anything at all. Ben was just gone. Miguel was already moving, his steps careful but urgent, scanning the ground for footprints, for any indication of where Ben had gone. But there was nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Panic clawed at Nathan's chest, but he fought against it, forcing himself to think. "Ben?" His voice carried through the trees, but no answer came. "Ben, if you can hear me, respond." Still nothing. Nathan turned to Sarah, but the look on her face told him she had already come to the same conclusion. Something had taken Ben. Miguel cursed under his breath, reaching for his radio. "Ben, if you're out there, say something." Static. Nathan didn't wait. He took off in the direction Ben had last been, his flashlight sweeping the jungle floor, searching for any sign of movement. The foliage was thick, the air heavy with moisture, and the scent of damp earth. Every instinct in him screamed that this was wrong, that whatever had just happened wasn't natural. He had been in the field for years, had seen the way people got lost, the way accidents happened, but this wasn't an accident. Ben hadn't just wandered off. He had been taken. Then, something flickered in the beam of his flashlight, a shape, half hidden in the undergrowth. Nathan stopped cold. It was Ben's radio, lying on the ground, smashed. A fresh wave of dread washed over him. Nathan knelt, his fingers grazing the broken device, his pulse racing. Ben wouldn't have just dropped this. And even if he had, it wouldn't be shattered like this. It looked like it had been crushed deliberately. Then, another sound. But this time, it wasn't behind him. It was right in front of him. Slowly, Nathan lifted his head. And that's when he saw it. Something or someone was standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight, barely visible through the tangle of leaves. It wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching him. Nathan's breath hitched. The shape was wrong. The proportions off, the outline shifting almost imperceptibly, as if the darkness itself was struggling to contain it. And then, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice didn't sound like Ben's. It didn't sound like anything Nathan had ever heard. It was layered, distorted, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. The words slithered through the air like a warning, curling around him with an almost physical weight. Nathan didn't move, couldn't move. Then, the thing took a step forward. And the last thing Nathan saw, before his flashlight flickered and died, was the glint of something sharp in the darkness. Nathan's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as the darkness swallowed the last flicker of his flashlight. The presence before him shifted, the sound of movement too fluid, too unnatural, like something not entirely bound by the laws of the world he knew. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the earth, as if the weight of the moment had paralyzed him. He wanted to believe that this was some kind of elaborate trick, that his mind was playing games in the thick jungle air. But then the voice came again, closer this time, pressing against his senses like a whisper, carried on the wind. "You've been looking in the wrong place." The words coiled around him, and for the first time, Nathan realized something unsettling. The voice, though layered and strange, was familiar. Not because he had heard it before, but because it carried an echo of someone he knew. Someone he trusted. A light flared suddenly behind him, cutting through the suffocating blackness. Miguel's voice rang out, sharp with urgency. "Nathan, step back." Nathan barely had time to react before the thing in front of him moved, faster than anything human should be able to. But just as suddenly as it had lunged, the light from Miguel's flashlight hit it fully, and in that instant, the shape seemed to shudder, its edges breaking apart like mist caught in a strong wind. A guttural sound filled the air, not a scream, not a growl, but something in between. Then, as if the jungle itself had devoured it, the figure disappeared. Silence crashed over them, thick and oppressive. Nathan stumbled back, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Miguel was already pulling him up by the arm, his grip firm, his expression unreadable. "We need to move. Now?" Sarah appeared from the trees, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. What the hell just happened? Nathan swallowed hard, his pulse still erratic. He turned to Miguel, who was gripping his rifle with white-knuckled intensity. His jaw clenched so tightly, it looked like he was fighting to keep something buried. "You know something," Nathan said, his voice rough with disbelief. "Don't you?" Miguel didn't answer right away. And that silence, that hesitation, was enough to send a fresh wave of unease through Nathan's gut. Finally, Miguel exhaled, his shoulders stiff, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." Nathan narrowed his eyes. Come to what? Miguel turned away, his gaze sweeping the jungle as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. Then, he finally spoke, his voice lower than before, weighed down by something Nathan couldn't quite name. This isn't about the leopards. It never was. Nathan felt his stomach tighten. What are you talking about? We came here because of the Miguel, cut him off with a sharp look. That was just the bait. Sarah sucked in a breath. Bait? For what? Miguel's gaze met Nathan's, and for the first time since they arrived, there was something behind his eyes that unsettled Nathan more than anything else they had seen. Regret. This place, Miguel said slowly, as if each word carried a weight he could no longer hold. It was never about the animals. It was about us. Nathan's mind reeled, the puzzle pieces shifting in a way that no longer fit the picture he thought he had been assembling. Everything they had encountered, the unnatural snake attack, the warnings, the missing team members, the symbols carved into the trees, none of it was random. None of it was coincidence. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. We were lured here. Miguel didn't nod, didn't confirm it outright, but the look in his eyes was enough. Nathan's breath hitched. By who? Miguel hesitated, but this time, when he spoke, there was no avoiding the truth. You won't like the answer. Nathan clenched his jaw. Try me. Miguel exhaled sharply, as if making peace with what he was about to say. Then, in the heavy stillness of the jungle, he finally spoke the words that changed everything. The person who sent us here is one of us. The world seemed to tilt. Nathan felt as if the ground had just been ripped out from beneath him. His mind raced through possibilities, dissecting every conversation, every moment leading up to this. If Miguel was telling the truth, then someone on their team, someone they trusted, had orchestrated this entire thing. Sarah took an unconscious step back, her face stricken. No, that doesn't make sense. Why would one of us do this? Miguel's gaze darkened. Because whatever's out here, it isn't finished yet. Nathan's pulse thundered in his ears. Then we need to figure out who's behind this. Fast. Miguel nodded, his expression grim. And we need to do it before we end up like Ben. The weight of those words settled over them, thick and suffocating. There was no more denying it, no more pretending. This was just an expedition gone wrong. They weren't here by accident. They were here because someone had wanted them here. And whoever it was still with them. Nathan felt like his entire body was running on adrenaline, his pulse a constant hammer in his ears, as Miguel's words settled into his bones. The realization that one of their own had led them here, had orchestrated this nightmare from the very beginning, sent a cold, creeping dread through his veins. His mind raced through the possibilities. Who could have done this? Who would have had the knowledge, the influence, and the motive to pull them into something this calculated? Every person in their group had their own reasons for being here, but now, those reasons felt like carefully placed distractions, like pieces of a puzzle designed to mislead them. His instincts told him to start looking at everyone differently, to question every word, every movement, every glance, exchanged in the dim glow of their remaining flashlights. But before he could say anything, before he could begin piecing together the betrayal that was unraveling around them, another sound cut through the air. A voice, faint, strained, coming from deeper in the jungle. It was Ben. Nathan's heart lurched. Ben, who had vanished without a sound. Ben, who had left behind a broken radio, who had been swallowed by the same darkness that had nearly taken Nathan moments ago. And now, against all logic, his voice was reaching out to them from somewhere unseen. But something was wrong. There was no desperation in his tone, no frantic cries for help, just his name, spoken slowly, deliberately. Nathan. The syllables stretched unnaturally, like the jungle itself was twisting the sound. Sarah stiffened beside him, her grip tightening around the strap of her pack. "That's not possible," she whispered, more to herself than to them. That he was gone. Miguel didn't move. His entire body was locked in place, his expression unreadable, but Nathan could see the war raging behind his eyes. He was weighing something, measuring the risk of what they all knew was coming. Then Ben's voice came again. Closer this time. "Nathan, you need to see." The word sent a violent shiver down Nathan's spine. He knew that voice. Knew Ben's tone, his inflections, but this wasn't it. This was off, subtly wrong in a way that made his stomach twist. Nathan turned to Miguel, his voice low but urgent. "That's not him, is it?" Miguel didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, like a man bracing himself for something he had been dreading. "We can't assume anything," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "But if it is him, we can't leave him out there." Nathan hated how much sense that made. Every part of him was screaming to run, to leave this place behind, before whatever was out there decided it was done playing games. But if there was even a chance that Ben was alive, that he was waiting for them to come for him, how could he turn his back on that? Sarah took a slow, unsteady breath. "This is a trap," she said, and there was no uncertainty in her voice, only raw fear. "You know this is a trap." Miguel's jaw tightened. "I know, but we don't have a choice." Nathan swallowed hard, his mind racing through the worst-case scenarios. "Then we do this carefully. We don't split up. No one walks ahead alone. And if anything feels wrong, we turn back." Miguel nodded, his grip firm on his rifle. Sarah, though pale and visibly shaken, didn't argue. Together, they moved. Every step deeper into the jungle felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something waiting just beyond their understanding. The air was thick, suffocating, the only sounds the rhythmic rustling of leaves beneath their boots, and the faint, persistent murmur of Ben's voice. It was leading them, guiding them deeper into the unknown, until the trees finally parted, revealing a clearing unlike anything they had seen before. The ground was littered with symbols, those same twisted carvings they had found before, but now they stretched in a wide, spiraling pattern, as if marking something far greater than they had originally believed. In the center, standing perfectly still, was Ben. Nathan's stomach clenched. He looked like Ben. Same clothes, same height, same familiar stance. But something was wrong. His face was too pale, his skin stretched too tight, and his eyes were wrong. "Nathan," Ben said, his lips curving into a slow, unnatural smile. "You finally made it." Miguel lifted his rifle slightly, not aiming directly, but close enough that it was clear he was prepared to use it. Sarah took a small step back, her breath coming fast and uneven. Nathan forced himself to speak, though his throat was dry. "Ben, what happened to you?" Ben's head tilted slightly, like he was considering the question. "I learned," he said finally, his voice steady, too steady. "I saw the truth. And now, so will you." Nathan's blood ran cold. "What truth?" Ben took a slow step forward, and it took everything in Nathan not to recoil. "That you were never here to save anything. You were brought here to finish what was started long ago. And it's time you stopped pretending you don't know why." Nathan's body went rigid. "What?" Ben's smile widened, and suddenly, his voice shifted, layered, distorted, just like the one Nathan had heard in the darkness before. "You already know, Nathan. You've always known." The words hit like a physical force, knocking the breath from his lungs. Because deep down, buried beneath his determination, beneath the fear and confusion, there was something, a memory, a truth he had ignored. And in that moment, Nathan realized whatever this was, whatever had taken Ben, it wasn't just targeting them. It had been waiting for him. Nathan's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as the weight of Ben's words settled into his chest like an iron vice. The jungle pressed in around them, thick and unyielding, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating realization tightening in his mind. This wasn't just about the leopard attacks. This wasn't about the missing people. This was something much bigger, something that had been orchestrated long before they ever set foot in this place. And now, Ben, or whatever was left of him, was standing at the center of it, speaking in a voice that didn't belong to him anymore. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to back away, to grab Sarah and Miguel and run, but he couldn't move. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening, why he had been dragged into this. Because Ben was right about one thing deep down. Nathan had always known something was wrong. Not just here, but before. Long before. Miguel shifted beside him, his grip tightening on his rifle, his jaw clenched so tightly that it looked like he was physically restraining himself from acting. There was a tension in the air, a suffocating weight that made every second feel like it was dragging them deeper into something they couldn't escape. Sarah was barely breathing, her entire body rigid, her eyes locked onto Ben as if looking away for even a second would shatter whatever fragile balance was holding this moment together. Nathan could feel it, the unspoken war in her gaze, the way she seemed caught between whatever loyalty had bound them before and whatever force had its claws in her now. Nathan forced himself to speak, though his throat was dry and his voice hoarse. "Who did this to you, Ben?" His words were meant to cut through the silence, to force some kind of clarity into the madness that had unraveled before them. But Ben's expression barely flickered, his eyes remaining steady, void of any hesitation. "I chose this," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. The words sent a sick chill down Nathan's spine. Miguel finally snapped, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "That's a damn lie." His knuckles whitened around his weapon, his stance shifting, ready to put an end to this. But Ben only turned his gaze to him, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, something cold and calculating. Nathan didn't like it. He didn't like the way Ben was looking at Miguel, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You always were so eager to fight," Ben murmured, his voice slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "But this isn't a battle you can win. Not with bullets. Not with brute force." His eyes flicked back to Nathan, studying him. "You, though. You still have time to make the right choice." Nathan's entire body stiffened. Every muscle, every instinct screamed against whatever it was that Ben was trying to lead him into. "What choice?" he asked, his voice even, despite the dread pooling in his stomach. Ben stepped forward, slow, unafraid. Miguel immediately reacted, snapping his rifle up in warning. "Move another inch, and I swear do it," Ben said, unblinking. "See what happens." Miguel's finger twitched on the trigger. For a heartbeat, Nathan thought he was going to fire, thought that maybe this time, someone would put an end to Ben's madness before it spiraled further. But Miguel didn't, and Nathan wasn't sure if it was restraint or if something deeper, some primal instinct buried in the marrow of his bones, was warning him that shooting Ben wouldn't change anything. Ben exhaled, almost disappointed. "You don't understand the scale of this, do you?" He shook his head, the faintest hint of amusement curling at his lips. "You think this is about me?" His voice dropped, something in it almost pitying. "No, I'm just the beginning." Nathan's pulse hammered against his skull. Beginning of what? Ben smiled, but there was no warmth, no trace of anything human in it. "You'll see." And then, before Nathan could react, before the sick weight of Ben's words could fully register, Ben turned his head just slightly to someone behind them. Nathan barely had time to process it before the sharp, mechanical click of a gun being cocked shattered the air. "Step away from him," a voice ordered, low and sharp. Nathan went rigid. He knew that voice. Slowly, dreading what he would find, he turned his head only to feel the entire world tilt beneath him. Sarah. She stood just a few feet away, her face unreadable, her hands steady as she leveled a gun directly at him. Miguel reacted instantly, shifting his aim toward her, his expression twisted with disbelief and fury. "What the hell are you doing, Sarah?" His voice was raw, like the words physically hurt to say, like he couldn't believe them even as they left his lips. Sarah's expression didn't waver. Her grip didn't falter. "You need to put the gun down, Miguel," she said, her voice calm. Too calm. Nathan's heart pounded against his ribs, a sick, relentless rhythm. "Sarah, I don't want to hurt you, Nathan," she interrupted, her tone eerily steady. "But I will, if you don't listen." Nathan's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. Sarah had been with them from the beginning. She had fought, bled, suffered alongside them. She had been afraid, just like them. She had needed them. Had it all been a lie? Every moment, every desperate decision they had made together. He forced himself to breathe, to push past the shock clawing at his mind. "Sarah, talk to me. What is this? What are you doing?" Her eyes flickered just for a second, and in that brief, fleeting moment, Nathan saw something else. Hesitation. Maybe even regret. "You were never supposed to figure it out," she admitted, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. "You were supposed to leave. You weren't supposed to push this far." Nathan felt like the ground beneath him was splitting apart. "Leave? Sarah, we were lured here." "We were, yes," she cut in. Her voice was sharp now, something breaking inside her. "And if you had just stuck to the plan, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Nathan clenched his jaw, trying to force some kind of sense into what was happening. "What plan?" Sarah exhaled, long and slow, like someone breaking apart at the seams. Then, she spoke words that made Nathan's blood turn to ice. "You were never meant to make it out." Miguel cursed under his breath, his grip on his rifle shaking. "You knew." His voice was raw with betrayal, his breath uneven. "This whole time, you knew what was happening, and you said nothing?" Sarah didn't look at him. Her eyes remained locked on Nathan, like he was the only one who mattered. Nathan's hands curled into fists. "Why?" Sarah swallowed, and for the first time, the cracks in her composure deepened. "Because I didn't have a choice." Nathan stared at her, searching for something, anything of the person he had once known. But all he saw was a stranger standing in her place. And then Ben spoke again, his voice smooth, almost pleased. "You understand now, don't you?" He gestured towards Sarah. "She's just one. There are more. Always have been. And they're not the only ones watching." Nathan's breath caught. "Who else is involved?" Ben tilted his head slightly. "You'll meet them soon enough." And that was it. That was the moment when the weight of it all truly crashed down, the lies, the deception, the impossible scale of what they were up against. This wasn't just about them. This wasn't just about one betrayal. This was bigger. Far, far bigger. And now, there was no turning back. Nathan's pulse roared in his ears as the truth unfolded before him in its full monstrous form. Everything he had believed, every desperate hope, that they had simply stumbled into chaos, shattered under the weight of Sarah's betrayal and Ben's cryptic certainty. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just some horrifying coincidence of nature and misfortune. They had been brought here, manipulated like chess pieces, in a game they never even knew they were playing. And worse, this wasn't just about them. There were more. More people, more layers, more unseen hands pulling the strings from the shadows. The realization sank into his bones like ice, but there was no time to dwell on it. Not when Sarah still had the gun trained on him. Not when Ben stood there, a vessel for something far older and far more insidious than any of them had ever imagined. Not when Miguel was one wrong move away from setting everything ablaze. Nathan's mind raced. If they hesitated, they were dead. If they fought, they might still be dead. But if they thought, if they saw beyond the immediate danger, beyond the tension coiled in Sarah's trembling fingers, then maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. He turned his focus to her, shutting out Ben's eerie stillness, shutting out the suffocating hum of the jungle. "Sarah," he said, forcing his voice to steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I know you, and I know this isn't what you wanted." For a flicker of a moment, something in her cracked. A breath hitched. A muscle in her jaw clenched, and Nathan saw it, the battle raging behind her eyes. The guilt, the doubt, the war between whatever had forced her into this and whatever was left of the person he had trusted. He could almost feel it, the pull of two opposing forces warring within her, the part that had once been his ally versus whatever darkness had claimed her now. He had to reach her before it was too late. "You don't have to do this," he pressed, his voice steady despite the weight of what hung between them. "Whatever they promised you, whatever hold they have on you, you can fight it." The words came out more like a plea than a demand, but Nathan didn't care. He needed her to hear him, to understand that she still had a choice, that she wasn't beyond saving. Sarah exhaled sharply, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Only something raw and shattered. "You don't understand, Nathan. It's bigger than us. It's always been bigger than us. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I chose this?" Her voice cracked, and she shook her head, her eyes dark and hollow, filled with something that almost looked like regret. "You don't choose them, Nathan. They choose you. And once you're in, there's no way out." Miguel let out a low growl, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles went white. "There's always a way out," he snapped, his voice thick with anger. "You just have to be willing to take it." He wasn't pleading the way Nathan was. Miguel didn't do pleads, but there was a fire in his words, an unyielding certainty that refused to accept Sarah's defeat. Ben's eerie, knowing smile deepened, as if he was watching something amusing unfold before him. "Still so stubborn, Miguel," he murmured, voice like a blade cutting through the thick air. "You really think you can stop this? That you can fight something that's older than any of you? Something that's already won?" There was no malice in his tone, no gloating, just cold certainty, as if he wasn't just stating a belief, but a fact. Nathan refused to let those words take root, refused to believe they were doomed before they even had a chance to fight. Because if he did, if he let that doubt seep in, then they had already lost. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, keeping his gaze locked onto Sarah's. "You can walk away from this," he said, voice low but thick with quiet urgency. "But you have to choose it. No more lies. No more fear. Just choose." Sarah's breath hitched. Her hands trembled, fingers tightening around the gun she held, and for one terrible, endless second, Nathan thought she might pull the trigger anyway, that maybe she was too far gone, too deeply entangled in whatever nightmare had claimed her. But then, with a sharp, shuddering breath, her grip slackened. The gun slipped from her hands, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Miguel lunged before she could change her mind, kicking the weapon away with a sharp movement. But Sarah didn't resist. She stood there, unmoving, shoulders sagging, her face crumbling under the weight of everything, the lies, the betrayals, the choices that had led her to this moment. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to feel it all, and it was breaking her apart piece by piece. Ben, however, only watched, unfazed, unshaken, his expression unreadable. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying a puzzle he had already solved long ago. "Interesting," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, his gaze shifted back to Nathan, something dark flickering in his eyes. "You think this changes anything?" Nathan squared his shoulders, jaw tightening. "It changes everything." Ben smiled. Slow. Knowing. "You're wrong." And then the jungle moved. The ground beneath them shifted, not in the way of a simple tremor, but as if something massive was stirring beneath the earth itself. A sound not quite a roar, Not quite a whisper rumbled through the trees, deep and ancient, like the exhale of something that had been waiting far too long to wake. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and then Nathan saw them, the symbols, carved into the earth, pulsing with a faint, eerie glow, as if alive. A sickening realization gripped him, cold and merciless. Ben had never been the real threat. He had only been the messenger. Miguel grabbed Nathan's arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "We run," he snarled, urgency crackling in his voice like static before a storm. Nathan didn't argue. They tore through the jungle, adrenaline surging through their veins, feet pounding against the shifting ground. The air was thick, oppressive, alive. Whatever they had disturbed, whatever had been waiting beneath the surface of this nightmare, was fully awake now. And it was coming. Sarah ran alongside them, silent but shaking, her face pale with the weight of everything she had done and everything she could never take back. Nathan wanted to feel anger, wanted to demand answers, but there was no time for any of it. No time for fury. No time for grief. Only survival. They didn't stop. Not when the trees trembled around them. Not when a shape, something vast, something impossible, rose in the distance, its form obscured by the thick, shifting air. Not when Ben's laughter echoed after them, no longer human, but something else entirely. They ran until the jungle broke open, until they saw the river, until they saw the boat. The one they had thought was gone. The one that was waiting. Miguel didn't hesitate. He leapt in first, starting the engine with hands that shook only slightly. Nathan turned just once, just for a second, and saw the thing in the jungle shift again, its form still unseen, but its presence undeniable. Watching. Waiting. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes hollow, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over." Nathan swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest. "I know." The boat lurched forward, tearing away from the shore, the river stretching wide before them. The jungle loomed behind, monstrous and ancient, a thing wrapped in shadow and secrets. But they were out. For now. As the boat cut through the water, Nathan felt the weight of everything settle onto his shoulders. The lies, the betrayals, the thing that had chosen them. Sarah was right. It wasn't over. It would never be over. But for now, they had survived. And sometimes, survival was the only victory that mattered. Still, as the jungle faded into the distance, as the weight of unseen eyes burned into his back, Nathan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. Not even close.